Artemis 2 is sending 4 astronauts to the moon for the first time since 1972. Like, it's happening this month. As someone who has spent most of their adult life learning about the Apollo program, making space race content, who's met 16 Apollo astronauts, I have to be honest, I'm not that excited about the mission. It feels weird to not be excited about humans returning to the moon, and even weirder that there's been almost no news coverage. I mean, did you even know this was happening? There's actually a lot to say about Artemis 2, about the landscape it came from and what it's theoretically starting, and why none of it feels right or exciting or inspiring, which feels at odds with spaceflight being so baked into America's national identity. Hi, I'm Amy. Welcome back to my second channel. Let's dive in. I have had such a hard time organizing my thoughts on this one, and to be super clear, this is all my own feelings and my own opinions. I think we need a fair bit of history and context to really dig into this, and it's messy. So instead of trying for a linear narrative and turning this into a huge discussion, I've decided we're just going to go point by point. We'll start with the mission and its backstory, then look at our history of Mars promises, then the Apollo comparison because I'm an historian and it's kind of what I do. And last, we'll talk about the future this mission is ostensibly ushering in. And at every stage, the key question I want to focus on is why. All right, let's start with our first point, the Artemis 2 mission. Artemis 2 is sending 4 astronauts to the moon. The exciting element and what has a lot of people talking is that this is the first time humans are leaving low Earth orbit since Apollo 17's lunar landing mission in 1972, which is awesome and honestly a long time coming. So why doesn't seeing this stack on the launch pad feel exciting? Well, a key thing for me is that this mission has been such a long time coming. There's almost a feeling of fatigue. So let's look at where all this technology came from, because this stack story starts 22 years ago in 2004. In 2004, President George W. Bush pitched a new vision for space exploration centered around a spacecraft called the Crew Exploration Vehicle. The shuttle was facing retirement, and this was going to be the workhorse for a new generation. He wanted to see it fly by 2008, human missions by 2014, and astronauts going to the moon by 2020. Mars was the goal in the 2030s, sort of a spiritual successor to Apollo. Internal studies turned Bush's vision into the Constellation program, which, if you're a space person, you might remember this. Constellation's architecture had 2 new rockets based on shuttle technology called the Ares 1 and the Ares 5 that would launch a gumdrop-shaped spacecraft called Orion. I know that's kind of a lot of names, so Constellation's the program, Orion's the spacecraft, and Ares is the rocket, just as a recap. NASA administrator at the time, Mike Griffin, called Constellation Apollo on steroids and wanted to get it flying by 2012, which was just a year after the shuttle's last scheduled flight. But things didn't get off to a great start. When Obama succeeded Bush in the White House in 2008, there had only been one Ares 1 prototype launch, and his transition team found out that the entire program was like $3.1 billion over budget, and at least 3 years behind schedule. And the verbiage was starting to shift. Now it was going to get astronauts to the moon by 2020. The whole on the moon thing was slipping to the 2030s. The bottom line was, without a budget increase on the order of $3 billion a year, Constellation wouldn't be able to get off the ground. So the Obama administration canceled the program. So why is the Constellation program relevant to Artemis? Well, no one was happy with how Constellation was canceled. When NASA released its 2011 budget estimates, there was just nothing listed for the program. You can't really do that. NASA budget decisions have to go through Congress, and Congress people have a vested interest in NASA's budget because with centers all over the country, many of them have constituents that rely on NASA programs for jobs. Canceling Constellation in favor of commercial partners killed a lot of jobs. So Congress fought back and demanded Obama create a new rocket to create jobs in industry-reliant areas, and this is where it starts to get a little bit silly. In making its demand, Congress didn't care what the rocket was or what it did. A rocket just needed to exist, and it needed to be big and powerful enough to launch heavy things into space. There wasn't even a specification of what the things needed to be. It just needed to launch things. Congress demanded that NASA pour through shuttle parts and designs to find something it could turn into a rocket, and that rocket had to launch by the end of 2016. That rocket is SLS, the one launching Artemis 2. It's properly called the Space Launch System, but also not entirely jokingly called the Senate Launch System because it wasn't built to meet NASA's needs, it was built to meet Congress's needs. It was a jobs program. I heard Lori Garver, who was deputy administrator under Obama, call it exactly that a week ago. At the same time, Orion was pulled out of the Constellation scrap heap as the crew vehicle, and that's the spacecraft for Artemis 2. The Jobs rocket program never really had a goal. There was never a why. So missions were retroactively figured out based on its abilities. There was an asteroid mission on the books for a while and a vague lunar landing goal. Then during Trump's first term, the program was given a name, Artemis, and suddenly a directive to land on the moon's south pole and lay the groundwork for a Mars landing. So those aren't necessarily goals that this stack was designed for, and the Orion spacecraft is not a lander, and the initial timeline was completely insane. In 2019, the Trump administration directed NASA to land in 2024. That would have needed a massive influx of funding, which it just didn't get. In 2020, with a $4.7 trillion national budget, NASA's allocation was just 0.45% of federal spending. The last time NASA had funding that low, percentage-wise, was 1960. That's not a level that can support a fast-tracked lunar landing program. Now, whether or not we should fast-track a lunar landing or a Mars landing is a different question and something we'll get to in just a little bit. So Artemis limped along, carrying with it not just constellation heritage technology, but problems too. Because this new iteration isn't exactly cheaper. It's still hugely over budget. The first mission, Artemis 1, finally launched on November 16th of 2022, an uncrewed mission around the moon that was nearly 6 full years behind schedule. The flight that's about to go is the second launch, more than 3 years later. All of that is the backstory of Artemis 2. It's messy and it's fragmented and it's old technology with a ballooning cost. But it's our first step to getting boots on Mars, right? You kind of need to take some unexciting steps and retread old ground to forge a big new path. Well, we've kind of been here before, a few times. Let's look at point number 2. We have to talk about how many times we've been told we're 10 to 20 years from a Mars landing. Mars isn't a new goal, not by a long shot. When Nixon took office in 1969, NASA presented him with a new program to take over from Apollo. This was all new hardware with a new goal. The shuttle/station would be the path to Mars. It was a different way of exploring space. The spaceplane-inspired shuttle was reusable. It would make access to orbit cheap, reliable, and routine, with up to 50 launches a year and even simultaneous missions. All these flights would go out to an orbiting space station that would eventually be staffed by up to 100 astronauts and would serve as a staging and launch point for longer deep space missions, back to the moon and then eventually Mars. When it was pitched, human missions to Mars were deemed possible as early as 1981, if it got adequate funding. Well, Nixon deemed the cost too high and approved the shuttle without the station, which I always feel is the space version of The Simpsons' escalator to nowhere. The shuttle started flying in 1981. In 1984, Reagan directed NASA to build a space station called Freedom, which wasn't quite as big as the original plan, but it was at least a place for the shuttle to go. Then on July 20th, 1989, George Bush I proposed what became the Space Exploration Initiative, a dedicated humans to Mars program aiming for a landing within 30 years. It was ambitious, and the roughly $500 billion price tag was so far outside America's abilities that the program was dead within 15 months. We can add Constellation to this list. It had a similar 30-odd year timeline that was ultimately killed because of the cost. And this 30-year promise killed by cost cycle isn't unique to NASA. Private companies are also already starting to see how budgets inflate and timelines slip. In 2016, Elon Musk planned to have a rocket codenamed BFR see tests in 2019, orbital tests in 2020, and then missions to Mars in 2022. In 2017, that timeline was adjusted for 2 cargo landers on Mars in 2022, and then 4 landers, 2 crewed, in 2024. In 2020, he was highly confident that SpaceX would land humans on Mars by 2026 if everything went well. So we've kind of been in this position of a Mars landing being 10 to 20 years away, almost as long as we've been in space. And the same reality keeps cropping up. Space is hard and it's expensive, and yet we still insist on pursuing these fast-tracked programs to get there. Why? Why are we skipping infrastructure that would admittedly take decades to build, but would last a long time, just to get there fast? Well, this leads us nicely into point 3, our historical comparison with Apollo, which was a fast-tracked program to land on the moon. And specifically, since we're talking about Artemis 2, the comparison with its historical equivalent, Apollo 8. NASA was created as a direct result of the Soviet Union launching Sputnik. Their demonstration of more powerful missiles demanded a response in kind, and Eisenhower lumped all things that were starting to explore space under one umbrella: That's NASA. And this is important. NASA took over all of the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics sites and labs, so had 40 years of world-class aviation, supersonic, hypersonic, and human factors research all under its belt from the get-go. A lunar program was internally called Apollo and tentatively on the books as early as 1960, but the immediate plan was for a slow and steady exploration of space. Then Kennedy succeeded Eisenhower in office and suffered two massive hits in April of 1961. Yuri Gagarin became the first person to orbit the Earth, and the Bay of Pigs fiasco. To save face, he needed a goal America could achieve before the Soviets. He looked to NASA because even though it hadn't launched a human yet, it had stunning brainpower and organization. He was told the moon would be doable within a decade, though it would need a lot of money, and he made it NASA's goal. It was a Cold War battlefield that didn't have any weapons, but it imbued Apollo with a very compelling reason why it should go to the moon. But even with that really compelling why, Kennedy kind of regretted it because, care to take a guess? It was horrifyingly expensive. He discussed this in private with NASA Administrator Jim Webb.
But I do think we ought to get it really clear that the policy ought to be that this is the top priority program of the agency. Otherwise, we shouldn't be spending this kind of money because I'm not that interested in space.
He also brought it up in a speech at the United Nations in 1963, wherein he called to cancel Apollo in favor of a joint mission with the Soviets to ease Cold War tensions.
Surely we should explore whether the scientists and astronauts of our two countries, indeed of all the world, cannot work together in the conquest of space, sending someday in this decade to the moon, not the representatives of a single nation, but the representatives of all of our countries.
But then he was assassinated 2 months later. For Apollo, this added another really compelling reason why it had to go to the moon. Not only did it need to beat the Soviets in this Cold War race, it had to fulfill a fallen president's mandate. What followed was a crash program in that it took the path of least resistance without really thinking about long-term planning. The technology was pretty purpose-built for Apollo's specific mission, but there was also a technologically amazing push to learn how to live and work in space in the meantime. Mercury taught NASA that humans could function in orbit. Gemini, my all-time favorite program, taught things like spacewalks, orbital rendezvous, proved that fuel cells could work, saw long-duration missions, and even one simultaneous flight. There were also robotic missions to learn about the moon, the Ranger and Surveyor programs. And behind all this, Apollo was taking shape. The command service and lunar modules and the Saturn V rocket were all going through testing. It was awesome. Then NASA hit a major setback with the Apollo 1 fire on January 27, 1967, that took the lives of the crew. It also revealed both technical and management flaws. The command module needed a substantial redesign, which impacted the already very tight schedule. Making things worse, the lunar module was also falling behind schedule. In a frankly wild decision to recoup lost time, NASA management decided, in an era where spaceflight was super new and experimental, to send the second ever manned Apollo mission to the moon with just the main spacecraft, the command service module, no lander. For its era and program, the decision was risky and bold, but it was the best way to keep things on track. It was a compelling why. That's the build-up to Apollo 8. Apollo 8 flew to the moon without a lander, but was a stepping stone to the surface. Artemis 2 is flying to the moon without a lander, but it's a stepping stone on the moon to Mars pipeline. But it's actually doing less than Apollo 8. Okay, full transparency, I thought it was going into orbit until last week when a friend of mine sent me some pictures from Mission Control, because I have friends that work in Mission Control and that's super cool. And I actually looked at this graphic that was hanging on a wall. Artemis 2 was a flyby. It's not going into orbit. It's doing a mission NASA didn't consider worth the time, money, or risk in the 1960s. Without getting super in the weeds on orbital mechanics, a flyby in this case is kind of free. The moon is orbiting the Earth, so you have to launch to where the moon will be in 3 days' time because that's about how long it takes to get there. At least that's how long it took Apollo. When you get there, the moon's gravity takes over and pulls you around. But if you don't slow down enough to let the moon's gravity capture you into orbit, you're still going fast enough that you'll whip around the far side and be punted back home. Apollo mission started on this path, what's called a free return trajectory. Mid-course burns could adjust that trajectory to get them out of the free return path in favor of a better alignment for their landing site. The initial idea was to do exactly this free return flyby, but in November, management and the crew agreed that it made a lot more sense to go into orbit and really test the spacecraft's capabilities in major mission events, specifically the lunar orbit insertion burn and the trans-Earth injection burns, both burns done by the Service Propulsion System engine, or just the big one on the service module. They'd test the engine, and they'd also get a lot of photography for future planning and test things like guidance and comms in a lunar environment. Apollo 8 did a lot on its mission in terms of hardware and crew testing because that spacecraft was the mothership that was going to support every future landing. Artemis 2 isn't doing the same legwork because it's flying hardware that isn't going to be the mothership. Why is it going to the moon if it's not using technology we're going to use for future landings? Let's talk about our fourth point. What future is Artemis 2 starting? The Artemis program plan, as it stands at the time I'm recording this, and I'm going to hit you with a lot of details right now, is for Artemis 3 to actually land on the moon in 2027, exploring the South Pole where there are potentially vital minerals to mine. Artemis 3 will also put up the first piece of Gateway, which is a space station NASA and the European Space Agency are planning to build in orbit around the moon. Then Artemis 4 will land in 2028, spending more time on the surface and adding more pieces to Gateway. Artemis 5 will land in 2030 and field test a rover. In 2031, Artemis 6 will test some kind of lunar habitat. And in 2032, Artemis 7 will test some kind of pressurized lunar rover. This is all outlined in the 2025 budget request, but these missions aren't quite fait accompli. Artemis 3, the first landing, was initially designed to have SpaceX make the landing vehicle, its human landing system, a beast of a spacecraft that needs refueling in Earth orbit before it can go to the moon, and that mission alone would need something like 15 Starship launches or more to work. And if I'm understanding it right, the human landing system is just for the landing. The crew would still need to go to the moon in Orion launched on SLS, and the transfer between the two vehicles, kind of a lot. It would make sense if the Gateway station existed for the transfer point, but it doesn't exist yet. Then there's the trajectory. Destin from Smarter Every Day has a great video about this from an engineering perspective. I've linked it in the description. And while I'm not an engineer, what I understand about the mission is that it has some really weird and complicated trajectories, and there are a lot of challenges with building in abort scenarios to save the crew at every stage of the flight. This is something that Apollo definitely did, and it was exactly this preparedness that saved Apollo 13. And then there's Starship, or at least the lunar variant. It's so far behind schedule that in October of 2025, NASA reopened bids for other companies to step in and make that Artemis 3 landing. In 2023, Blue Origin won a contract to build the lander for the Artemis 5 mission, a very different vehicle, so at least there's options. It's kind of a mess. And it's not just the landing craft that are different between missions, it's the rockets too. Blue Origin has a reusable rocket, the New Glenn, a variant of which can support lunar missions. SpaceX has its Falcon 9, Falcon Heavy, and Starship, as well as the Dragon spacecraft. There has been talk that a Falcon Heavy could possibly launch an Orion spacecraft to the moon. And all of these names are relevant, because if you look at the 2026 discretionary budget request, and I have to say, while I'm recording this, this is all very much developing, SLS and Orion are facing cancellation. Artemis 2 kind of doesn't need to check out the hardware because the hardware has pretty much already been canceled. The 2026 budget request is refocusing NASA on, quote, beating China back to the moon and putting the first humans on Mars. To achieve these objectives, the budget would streamline the NASA workforce, information technology services, NASA center operations, facility maintenance, and construction and environmental compliance activities. The budget also terminates multiple unaffordable missions and reduces lower priority research, resulting in a leaner science program that reflects a commitment to fiscal responsibility. That is word salad with a dressing of red flags, so let's look at some line items. Legacy Human Exploration Systems is losing $879 million, which phases out the, quote, grossly expensive and delayed Space Launch System rocket and Orion capsule after 3 flights. Artemis 2 is Flight 2, Artemis 3 will be Flight 3, and then it's gone. There's a proposed increase in NASA's budget under human space exploration, which is the Moon to Mars pipeline, a total of $8 billion. But NASA isn't getting an overall budget increase of that $8 billion, so where is that money coming from? STEM programs are out. Missions that aren't directly supporting that Moon to Mars pipeline are being canceled, but the bulk is coming from space science, which is losing $2.265 billion. Mars Sample Return, a mission to bring back samples from the surface, has been on the books for years. The Perseverance rover has already collected the samples. It would be such an incredible mission, and it was canceled while I was writing this. And it actually gets almost sinister if we look at the leaked Project Athena document from recently confirmed administrator Jared Isaacman. Under Earth Science, there's talk to, quote, implement science as a service model, which sounds like cherry-picking data. There's also a goal of taking NASA, quote, out of the taxpayer-funded climate science business and leaving it for academia to determine. How are academics going to work on climate science without the missions to gather the data they work with? Most universities aren't space agencies, and they typically value football pads over launch pads. The document talks about an engineering strike team and finance strike team. It mentions attracting, quote, academic institution funding and evolving to become a force multiplier. On individual centers, it says of JPL, quote, contract structure very expensive, must increase the output and time to science KPI, and asks what is built in quotation marks at the site. Rovers. Rovers is one answer. JPL is the only lab that has landed on Mars. Multiple times. And there's talk of a rapid contract for 2026 Mars mission, Discovery Base. So we're losing space science to fast track a Mars landing. The Artemis 2 hardware is already obsolete, and there's even talk of NASA pulling out of Gateway now in favor of a direct landing architecture because, can you guess? Gateway is really expensive and taking money away from the Mars landing goal. So if NASA doesn't have hardware, and there's no station being built, where is that $8 billion of taxpayer money going? SpaceX and Blue Origin. Artemis is barely a program. Honestly, it feels like disparate pieces lumped under one name for convenience sake. And if everything is handed over to SpaceX and Blue Origin, it's less about the nation and more about two billionaires wanting to go to Mars. Yes, NASA has been leaning on commercial partners as a cost-saving measure for years, and people have made the argument to me that it's always been commercial partners. Grumman built the lunar module, North American Rockwell built the command module, Boeing, North American, and Douglas built the Saturn V. But their names weren't on the side of the rocket. It was just an American flag. And everything was managed by NASA to work together. If we look at these two landers, we can see private companies are really developing their own individual architectures. The Apollo missions were paid for by Americans, launched for America. NASA was founded and works on the idea that we as a nation have decided that exploring space and leveraging the science that comes from that exploration is a worthy national investment. Seeing these missions going up with a company logo just doesn't feel the same for me. It feels like abandoning science and exploration to give billionaires bragging rights. And here's where the really sinister part comes in. I can't get away from the idea that these companies will get half their Mars funding by building data centers that are destroying the environment and leaving millions of people without basic things like clean water. Amazon is getting us all addicted to convenience and basically has a monopoly on the instant gratification market, with a massive environmental cost from emissions of shipping and plastic from packaging. Mars might be possible because of corporate monopolies making us pay for everything, on top of the tax dollars that they're also going to get from us. Isaacman, a billionaire who is paid to go to space with SpaceX, is well placed to help other billionaires gain. Canceling climate missions is a huge boon to billionaires. Companies have actively lobbied against climate science so they don't have to curtail dangerous practices and can keep making money, so they'd probably be thrilled to see Earth science canceled. Raleigh Williams' channel Climate Town is basically devoted to covering the ways that billionaires and huge companies have propagandized climate change with their very own science. He highlights this pretty viral moment when an Exxon lobbyist flat out says they aggressively fought against the science.
30 years of wasn't me's up in smoke in a single Zoom call.
Did we aggressively fight against some of the science? Yes.
And sure, all these companies have their green pledges, but we all know greenwashing is very common and popular right now. Cutting funding to climate science and canceling Earth missions kind of puts us in a position where these companies can just turn their propaganda machines up to 11. They get richer, everyone else suffers, and two private companies get to take their logos to Mars. We need Earth science data. We need these missions, and we're losing them. Why? And what if it all falls apart, like every fast-tracked Mars program has? What happens if the next administration cancels or changes the missions and the tax dollars dry up? Companies are beholden to shareholders. What if shareholders push back against the cost or the risk? What if years down the line, someone else is running those companies and decides to scrap it? We could be right back to 10 to 20 years from a Mars landing. Okay, and what if it works? What if we do see a human mission on Mars? What if we have one landing, but then it turns out building that million-person base proves to be completely untenable, and we've cut off every other avenue in space? we could be in a worse position, wistfully thinking about the good old days with zero space infrastructure. So why? Why are we obsessed with fast-tracking a mission to Mars? Is it because of China? Some people point to a space race with China, but that's barely a thing. China isn't open the way NASA is, so I can only say so much, but the country has been making steady progress with its own space station and has been taking steps towards a lunar landing for years. Years that NASA has spent retrofitting a mission into the Jobs rocket. Citing a space race with China feels like an excuse to me. Is it because we're in a horrifying anti-science era? I've just harped on a little bit about Earth science, but there's also spin-offs from NASA's technologies that are so much bigger than most people realize. Seemingly mundane things like more aerodynamic trucks for fuel efficiency, and really important medical technologies like LASIK, both have roots in NASA technology. Is it because we really want to explore the cosmos? If that's the case, it's stupid to go with humans right now. The New Horizons mission to Pluto cost $700 million for 15 years. Cassini's mission to Saturn, which included a lander on the chemically very interesting moon Titan, was a flagship mission with a cost of $3.9 billion over 20 years. Another major mission, Curiosity, cost about $3 billion. It was designed for 2 years on Mars and has lasted more than 12 and is still going. The Voyager missions that visited the 4 gas giants cost each taxpayer $8 cents. Imagine if we took that $8 billion and developed smaller robotic missions, how much we might find. As a comparison, Artemis 2 is costing $4.1 billion for 10 days and 1 whip around the moon's far side. Is it because we can? Well, for the moment, we can't. So why are we going? Why are we Frankensteining a program from various parts and absolutely cutting off all our science programs at the knees? I can't help but feel that with Mars, we've always been focused on the where and not the why. And I blame Apollo. Apollo was amazing and inspiring, but it also gave us a hugely unrealistic expectation of what spaceflight should look like. It's not a good model. It's not sustainable. Apollo painted this amazing future. The Apollo Applications Program had some holy crap cool missions that never came to be, and we've been chasing that future ever since, even after seeing programs canceled and goals scrapped. We still feel like we need to be doing the most impossible things in space because Apollo told us it's possible, and at this point we've kind of folded human space exploration into our national identity when we could and should be just as celebratory of the robotic missions that have done and are doing amazing things. We look at Apollo like it should be the rule in space exploration, but it should absolutely be treated as the exception. It was an exceptional endeavor with unique opportunities for success under the perfect circumstances to thrive. And I'd be remiss if I didn't touch on the social element. Apollo 8 flew in 1968, which was a really rough year for America, with MLK's assassination, RFK's assassination, huge protests against the war in Vietnam, and massive civil rights demonstrations, all against the backdrop of the Cold War. But regardless, trust in government was fairly high, though falling, and the mission flying over Christmas felt like a win for an exhausted country at the end of the year. NASA famously got a letter from a woman that just read, "You saved 1968." We're arguably in a worse spot right now, regardless of where you sit on the political spectrum. Healthcare costs are skyrocketing for a substantial number of Americans. The recession is worsening. People are struggling with basic necessities like groceries. We're seeing a massive rise in violence. Cost of living is at a crisis point. This country is well and truly divided right now. Trust in government is at an all-time low, with a growing number of people concerned about government spending. In this political and economic climate, I just don't think anyone's going to send a letter saying that Artemis 2 saved 2026. And it's all in flux anyways. Congress has pushed back, and the cuts to science are less than the 2026 budget proposal wanted, but that also means maybe now there's less to redirect towards the human side. It's all very unclear and feels very tenuous. And I have to say that none of this has any bearing on the crew. I want to make that super clear. I've spoken to 2 of the astronauts. Reed Weissman and I geeked out about his urine sample once. Not weird, good story, I promise. I'd spoken to him before, and then he DM'd me one day to tell me that after his physical at Johnson, he left his urine sample on a tray, and it was next to another little cup sample from Charlie Duke, the lunar module pilot on Apollo 16. He got kind of excited about it and had to geek out with another Apollo nerd about his pee's proximity to Great P. I DM'd him when he got selected for the mission that some astronaut someday would geek out when their pee was right next to his, and I loved his response. Honestly, one of my favorite astronaut interactions of all time. Reed Weitzman actually connected me with Jeremy Hansen, fellow Canadian, and we talked about supersonic flights in the F-86 when I was writing my last book. It was just an informal little interview. I just wanted to know what it feels like to go supersonic and then come back through in that plane, and he was great to talk to. They're both awesome, and I'm honestly thrilled that they were chosen for this mission. Look, I will freely admit that I am a slightly curmudgeonly historian, but I'm not alone on my feelings on all this. While there are people who are absolutely thrilled we're going back, when I texted a friend who was at NASA for 10 plus years about it, he responded with a vomit emoji. A couple of historian friends have used the word ambivalent. One friend is truly terrified about the crew's safety. There are concerns about Orion's heat shield, and speaking longer term, he's worried that the only way he'll see boots on Mars is if there are bodies along the way. One friend at NASA Goddard told me scientists are visibly confused and frustrated, trying to justify this flight. And check out these comments from my community. It's very sad to see Artemis still funded when so many useful projects have been canceled in the budget. Tracking of Earth resources / phenomenon and fundamental research are far more important for everyone than replaying a bygone era to funnel tax money into some politicians' county and their rich friends' pockets. I'm concerned that we're taking on Artemis with goals borrowed from the past in a political climate that's not receptive to the spending of the funds necessary to do it right. SLS is not an interesting rocket. It's disposable, and it's literally a bunch of strapped-together shuttle parts. It's a step back. Starship is a polarizing rocket. I'm pretty pessimistic on it, but at least it's new and interesting. I just don't see a point to Artemis. All of the science would be done better and more cost-effectively with probes. It just seems like we're risking some astronauts' lives for no reason. If we could see Artemis as a step forward in space exploration, then it may grab our interest. Inner child says yay. Outer adult says, pretty neat, but are we witnessing the beginning of a new space race which will slowly turn into another gold rush between countries and companies all eager to claim ownership and mine resources? I also find it mind-numbing that at a time we're going back to the moon, so many NASA resources are being ended, such as the Goddard Library and other things, so there's definitely a huge disconnect within the political framework of the US. TBH, I haven't heard that much about Artemis, but I do find it pretty difficult to be optimistic about a big government program these days, especially when I'm not sure what the scientific goals are, and I'm afraid the program is going to be a launching pad for commercial interests. And like I said, there are tons of people who are stoked, like this guy. I'm Team Space. I'm for anything and everything spaceflight and aerospace related. Hi, I'm editing this video right now, and I just want to come in with like a reinforcing on my final thought here, because I feel like people are going to say that no one knew Apollo was going to be successful and be inspirational before it happened, so you can't say that Artemis is not going to do something incredible or be inspirational. And of course, I can't tell you the future. I don't know what's going to happen. But you know, when Apollo was going, there was absolutely no precedent for any of this. There was nothing in space. There was very little aviation that had kind of captured the world like this, short of Amelia Earhart or Charles Lindbergh, Chuck Yeager. So there was nothing to say in Apollo that it was or was not going to work. And I mean, people in Washington thought it was an absolute boondoggle and that it was going to ruin careers if they worked for this newfangled space agency. That has played out very differently than people originally thought. So looking at Artemis from a modern standpoint, I mean, like I said, this is my own opinion, but also I'm looking back at 60 years of history. We have that history now to inform our opinion and our understanding of what's happening now. Also, I'm looking at this with 20 plus years of me researching 60 years of that history. So it is impossible to say what's going to happen and whether or not it'll be inspirational, but I think that's also kind of part of the problem with the way this mission has been sold, is that people keep talking about it, and there's a lot of verbiage about it being the next inspiration for a new generation, the thing that's going to inspire the next generation of science and engineering and all of that. But we can't say it's going to be inspirational unless it does something inspirational. And so far, it just hasn't quite hit that. So there's kind of just like a something that doesn't align for me in that as well. So I just wanted to kind of hit that because as I'm editing this, I feel like I didn't make it super clear that like we didn't have any background in space to lean on and kind of understanding and anticipating and seeing what we were doing with Apollo, whether it was right or wrong. But we have so much more history to look at now that it's worth taking that into consideration and taking that into consideration in our conversations about it. This video also feels like it's a little bit of an addendum to my video on the vintage space about why we haven't gone back to the moon, and it's basically looking at the interplay of politics and money in spaceflight and how they're all inextricably linked. And even though we are going back to the moon, everything I said in that video still stands. It's still very much a history lesson. But, you know, I only wrote it last year. I have very much the same feelings and came to the same conclusions in this video. So if you do want to kind of go more into the weeds on like why these programs haven't worked out and kind of how these things have all gone and like ebbs and flows, definitely check check that video out because it's got way more, way more of that historical background for you. Hi, I'm back in the same shirt, different day, because I literally saw some news in the last 2 days that I do want to address since we're talking about this mission and the future of NASA. So it looks like apparently there has been more funding allocated to the Artemis program that funds potentially through Artemis 5, which means instead of having 2 missions in the hardware that we're flying on Artemis 2, that would be Artemis 2 and Artemis 3, there's 2 additional missions, and there may be now money allocated to Gateway. So it's possible now that we are laying a bit more of a foundation, but everything I actually said in the video still stands. My biggest question is, then what? Because there doesn't seem to be a plan beyond what we do. 2 more missions doesn't make an entire program, so what happens after those 3 landing missions? There has now been a White House deadline of landing on the moon by the end of 2028. Not sure what the landers situation is right now, but it's looking like there may be more funding. We may be able to lay a bit of a foundation, but that's still kind of falling short of having a lasting presence on the moon and getting to Mars, which is what the big thing and the big goal is. So when SLS was first pitched and conceived, I was doing a lot more news coverage, and frankly, the fact that things change this fast and are this volatile is why I don't miss being in the news cycle. It was a really interesting concept of a rocket because it's modular. So you're able to do low Earth orbital missions and deep space missions, human and crew, with different lift capacities with the same basic technology. So you could theoretically build all the pieces and then put them together as needed for specific missions. But the idea was that that would go hand in hand with commercial partners taking over low Earth orbital missions so that NASA could then focus on the deep space missions and the science. And as we kind of talked about today, I feel like we kind of have gotten away from that a little bit because NASA has built this rocket, and I desperately want it to be the NASA program, but it feels like it's going over to other partners. And a friend of mine, I passed this article that was sent to me today to a couple friends, and they had the same reactions that they had when I talked to them about this idea weeks ago. The friend who sent me the vomit emoji was just like, what a colossal waste of money. And the friend who is concerned that the only way we'll see people on Mars is if there's bodies in the wake, his initial thought was, of course, it came from senators from Texas because that's job creation. My whole issue with all this is longevity in space, because we have 2 landing missions or we have 4 landing missions. Then what? There's still that big question of what comes after that. And I just feel like we're almost kind of kicking the can down the road a little bit. Great, we can have a couple more missions, we can get a bit more science, but then what? We're just delaying having to make a big decision about whether or not to retain this over budget rocket or try something different or pass it off to commercial partners. It feels like that's an inevitable point that we're going to get to. And I think we're delaying the inevitable on this. The one thing that I'm really happy with is how much science was saved. Everyone I've kind of talked to, and I talked about this on my Twitch stream tonight, very informally, and we all talked about being really happy that the science is coming back. It's not yet clear to me, at least I haven't seen any allocation for specific missions, which missions are coming back, whether or not we are returning to Earth science, because there is still that kind of idea from the current administrator that he wants to move away from taxpayer-funded climate science. So, I still really want to see a lot of that deep space science. Oh my God, I would love to see missions on Venus. There's actually been new data that says that there may be signs of life on Mars, which would absolutely preempt any human missions because we couldn't disturb that life. I know people that are really interested in the chemistry on Venus because that could have life. There's so much fascinating stuff, but all of that, I still desperately want all of the Earth science missions and the climate science missions. So I'm not sure what that science funding is going to exactly. So it may be less bad, but I still don't really know. Again, seems to be developing. Do not miss covering space news because of this. But everyone that I've spoken to is so much more excited about the science goals than the human goals right now because it feels like what we should be doing. So back to other editing me. Okay, I'm going to go wrap up the video now. At the end of the day, I love space and I want to see so much exploration. but I just can't feel good about it. When the mission is retrofitted into expiring technology, it's superseding amazing and important planetary and Earth missions, and it's opening the door to an era where NASA could become a contracting agency, funneling its budget to billionaires. It just doesn't feel good. And all of that is what's underscoring the Artemis 2 mission for me. This kind of casually presented but still very researched op-ed video is a format I've been really enjoying lately, and I've been wanting to experiment more with other topics and formats, but it's a little daunting considering the brand I've built on the vintage space and frankly with the topics I've covered. I'm working on some videos for both channels right now that are not only a bit of a shift for me, they're ripe for demonetization. And writing a book about the atomic bomb program means I have a lot of content coming up that is the result of years of research that might get buried or blocked because we're talking about really serious topics like the Second World War and the Cold War and nuclear weapons and being realistic about politics and death. And I'm never going to censor my language when we're talking about real issues and real history just because it might get me demonetized. I'm actually working on a video about censorship right now. I really want all those videos to be seen because it's important history to discuss, which is why I am so excited that I now have Nebula as a place to share all of my content from this channel and the vintage space. And frankly, with how many of you guys have been prodding me about this, I think some of you will be excited too. Nebula is a premium streaming service that puts creators first. It's curated, ad-free, and offers early access to thoughtful videos from creators who are genuinely passionate about the content they make. And part of it being a creator-first platform is that watching videos on Nebula more directly supports those creators, like myself. There are some incredible people there too. You can find Climate Town, whose channel I just talked about in this video, and people like my friend Tim Dodd, the Everyday Astronaut. Nebula offers monthly, yearly, or even lifetime subscriptions, which how nice does it sound to have access to all of that content without having to worry about yet another subscription. If you use my link, go.nebula.tv/thevintagespace, you can get 50% off an annual subscription. That is a full year of Nebula for just $30. This channel is going to be folded under the banner of the Vintage Space over on Nebula, which means all my work will be in one place. I'll be offering early access to my videos and very possibly extended cuts of my longer form stuff. And if I have a video that I don't think will survive being posted here or just doesn't feel like an organic fit to either channel, it'll be a Nebula exclusive. I'm really looking forward to it. I hope you guys come check it out. All right, that's going to do it for me today.